The cold wind cut through downtown like a knife that November morning. People hurried past with their heads down, pulling their coats tight around them. Most of them were heading to work or shopping, their minds busy with their own problems. They walked right past the man sitting on the concrete steps of the big shopping mall. His name was David, and he was 52 years old. But if you looked at him, you might think he was older. His face was weathered from sleeping outside too many nights. His beard was gray and unkempt. His clothes were clean but worn thin from too much washing at the shelter. On his back he wore an old military jacket with faded patches that told the story of his service. David held a piece of cardboard in his hands. Someone at the shelter had helped him write on it with a black marker. The words were simple but honest. Homeless veteran. Anything helps, God bless. He didn't like holding that sign, it made him feel small. But winter was coming and he needed help. Most people walked by without looking at him. Some dropped coins into the paper cup beside him without making eye contact. A few people smiled and said, "Thank you for your service," which always made David's chest tighten with emotion. He appreciated those words even though they couldn't fix his problems. But there was something else that caught David's attention every day he sat on those steps. Through the big glass doors of the mall, he could see into the main area where all the stores met. Right there in the center, like a beautiful black jewel, sat a grand piano. David had been watching that piano for 3 days now. It was part of some holiday decoration, surrounded by fake snow and twinkling lights. There was a small sign next to it that he could barely read from where he sat. But yesterday, a kind woman had told him what it said. Share your musical talents. Community music night every evening. Every time David looked at that piano, his fingers moved without him thinking about it. His damaged hands would twitch and dance as if they were touching real keys. People walking by probably thought he was having some kind of medical problem. They didn't know that those hands were remembering something beautiful from long ago, before the war. Before everything went wrong, David had been a different person. He grew up in a small town where his grandmother had an old, upright piano in her living room. When he was 7 years old, she started teaching him to play. At first, it was just simple songs. Twinkle, twinkle, little star, and Mary had a little lamb. But David had a gift. By the time he was in high school, David could play pieces that made grown people cry. His teacher said he had magic in his fingers. She talked about scholarships to music school, about maybe even playing in big concert halls someday. David would practice for hours, dreaming of wearing a fancy black suit and playing for thousands of people. But then his father lost his job at the factory. Money became tight at home. David's dreams of music school faded away like morning mist. Instead of going to college, he joined the army. He told himself it was the right thing to do. Serve his country, learn a trade, maybe save some money for school later. The army was good to David at first. He made friends with guys from all over the country. He learned discipline and teamwork. And whenever he found a piano on base or in town during leave, he would play for his fellow soldiers. They loved it. Some of them would gather around and sing along to old songs that reminded them of home. David served 2 tours in Afghanistan. He was a good soldier, always ready to help his brothers in arms. He thought he was lucky. He worked mostly with communications, equipment, staying relatively safe compared to the guys who went out on patrol every day. But luck runs out sometimes. It was his second tour, just 3 months before he was supposed to come home. David's unit was moving equipment from one base to another. It should have been a routine trip. The road had been cleared the day before. Everything seemed safe. The explosion happened so fast that David barely remembered it afterward. One moment he was sitting in the back of the truck, thinking about seeing his family again. The next moment, the world turned into fire and noise, and pain. The hidden bomb had been planted right where their truck would pass. When it went off, pieces of metal flew everywhere like deadly rain. David woke up 3 days later in a military hospital in Germany. His left hand was wrapped in so many bandages that it looked like a white club. His right hand was also bandaged, but not as badly. The doctors and nurses were kind, but they couldn't hide the worry in their eyes when they looked at him. When they finally unwrapped his hands, David understood why everyone looked so sad. His left hand was missing his ring finger and pinky finger completely. The explosion had taken them cleanly, like a terrible magic trick. His right hand was better, but deep scars ran across the palm and fingers where shrapnel had cut him. The doctor was a gentleman with gray hair and tired eyes. He had probably given this kind of news to too many young soldiers. "You're alive," he said softly. "That's what matters most. And your hands will work again. It will take time and therapy, but you'll be able to use them for most things." David nodded and said he understood. But inside, his heart was breaking. He kept thinking about the piano back home, about the dreams he had put aside for later. Now, later, would never come. The physical therapy was hard work. David had to learn how to use his damaged hands all over again. Simple things like buttoning his shirt or holding a fork took practice. Writing was difficult. The therapists were patient and encouraging, but David felt frustrated most of the time. One day, a music therapist came to see him. She had heard from the nurses that David used to play piano. She brought a small keyboard to his room and asked if he wanted to try playing something. David looked at the keyboard for a long time before touching it. When he finally put his hands on the keys, everything felt wrong. His missing fingers made gaps where there should have been music. His scarred right hand felt stiff and awkward. When he tried to play a simple song he had known since childhood, it sounded broken and sad. He pushed the keyboard away and asked the therapist to leave. After that, David stopped talking about music. When people asked about his hobbies or interests, he would change the subject. The piano became something from his past, like a photograph of a person who had died. The army took good care of David during his recovery. They gave him medals for his service and sacrifice. They provided medical care and counseling. When he was ready to leave the service, they helped him file for disability benefits and connected him with veteran services back home. But coming home was harder than David had expected. His small town looked the same, but he felt like a stranger. His family and friends tried to be supportive, but they didn't understand what he had been through. They would ask him to play piano at family gatherings, not realizing how much that hurt. David tried to find work, but his hands limited what he could do. Some employers were understanding about hiring veterans, but when they saw his disability, they would find reasons not to hire him. The jobs he did get never lasted long. He would get frustrated with tasks that used to be easy, or he would have bad days when memories of the explosion made it hard to concentrate. The disability payments from the government helped, but they weren't enough to live on comfortably. David moved into a small apartment in a rough part of town. He tried to make it work, but medical bills and everyday expenses slowly ate away at his savings. Then his grandmother died. She was the one who had first taught him to play piano, the one who had believed in his musical dreams. David went to her funeral and saw her old piano sitting in the corner of the living room, just like always. His family asked if he wanted it, but David couldn't bear the thought of having it in his apartment where it would just remind him of what he had lost. After the funeral, David started drinking more than he should. It helped numb the pain in his hands and the sadness in his heart, but drinking made everything else worse. He lost his apartment when he couldn't make rent. He bounced between friends' couches and cheap motels until his money ran out completely. The homeless shelter was clean and safe, but it was still the last place David had ever imagined he would end up. The people who worked there were kind and didn't judge him. They understood that many homeless people were veterans who had fallen through the cracks of a system that was supposed to help them. David had been living at the shelter for 6 months now. During the day, he would sit outside the mall with his sign, hoping for enough donations to buy food or maybe save a little money. In the evening, he would return to the shelter for dinner and a bed. But every day he found himself drawn to those steps where he could see the piano through the glass doors. Sometimes families would walk past it on their way to the food court. Occasionally, a child would run over and bang on the keys while their parents called them back. David would watch and remember what it felt like to make real music instead of just noise. The mall was busy today. Holiday shoppers moved in and out of the warm building while David sat in the cold. His hands were stiff from the weather, and his damaged fingers ached more than usual. But still, when he looked at that piano, his hands would move slightly, remembering songs he used to play. A woman walked out of the mall carrying shopping bags. She was probably in her 30s with kind eyes and a warm smile. She stopped when she saw David and dropped a $5 bill into his cup. "Thank you for your service," she said, like so many others did. But then she surprised him by sitting down on the step next to him. Most people hurried away after giving money as if staying too long might make them late or uncomfortable. "I work here at the mall," she said. "I've seen you sitting here for a few days. Are you doing okay?" David wasn't used to people actually talking to him. Usually they just gave money and left, or they walked by without looking at him at all. He cleared his throat, which was rough from the cold air. "I'm getting by," he said. "Just trying to stay warm and get enough to eat." The woman nodded. She looked at his military jacket and then at his hands holding the cardboard sign. That's when she noticed the scars and missing fingers. "Were you injured in service?" she asked gently. David nodded. "Afghanistan. A few years ago now." They sat quietly for a moment, watching people walk in and out of the mall. Then the woman asked something that surprised him. "Do you play music at all?" David's hands tightened on his sign. The question hit him like a small punch to the chest. "Why do you ask?" "I organize events here at the mall," she said. "We have community music nights where people can play that piano in the main area. I was wondering if you might be interested." David looked through the glass doors at the beautiful black piano. For a moment, he felt the old longing rise up in his chest. But then he looked down at his damaged hands and shook his head. "I used to," he said quietly, "but not anymore. These hands aren't made for music now." The woman followed his gaze to his scarred fingers and missing digits. Her expression grew thoughtful, but not pitying. "Music isn't just about perfect hands," she said. "It's about heart, and I bet you have plenty of that." Before David could respond, she stood up and shouldered her shopping bags. "Think about it," she said. "We have music night every evening around 6 o'clock. If you change your mind, just come inside and find me. My name is Jennifer, and I'll be around the piano area." She walked back into the mall, leaving David alone with his thoughts and the cold wind. He looked at the piano again, and for the first time in years, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, there might still be music left in his broken hands. The afternoon wore on, and the sun began to set early as it did in late fall. David counted, the money in his cup, enough for dinner and maybe a cup of coffee to warm up. But his mind kept wandering back to Jennifer's words and the piano that seemed to call to him through the glass. As evening approached, and the mall's lights grew brighter against the darkening sky, David made a decision that would change everything. He stood up slowly, his joints stiff from sitting on the cold concrete all day. He folded his cardboard sign and tucked it under his arm. For the first time in years, David walked through the front doors of the mall, not as someone looking for work or asking for help, but as someone who might have something to give. The warm air inside the mall hit David's face like a gentle hug after sitting in the cold all day. The sounds were different in here, softer somehow, with music playing quietly from speakers and the distant chatter of families enjoying their evening. His worn boots squeaked slightly on the polished floor as he walked toward the center of the mall where the piano waited. David felt nervous, like a kid walking into school on the first day. People were everywhere, shopping and talking and laughing. Some of them glanced at him as he passed, taking in his weathered appearance and military jacket. He could feel their eyes on him, and it made him want to turn around and go back outside. But something pulled him forward. Maybe it was the memory of music, or maybe it was just curiosity about what Jennifer had said. Music isn't just about perfect hands. It's about heart. Those words kept repeating in his mind as he made his way through the crowd. The piano area was decorated for the holidays with fake snow and twinkling lights. The big black piano sat in the middle of it all like the centerpiece of a fancy dinner table. A small group of people had gathered around it, and David could hear someone playing a cheerful Christmas song. The music wasn't perfect, but it was joyful, and David found himself smiling a little as he listened. When the song ended, people clapped and the player, a teenage girl with braces and a big grin, stood up and took a bow. Her family cheered for her, and she looked so proud and happy that David felt a pang of memory. He remembered feeling that way once, when music was pure joy instead of a reminder of loss. "Excuse me, are you looking for someone?" David turned to find a woman approaching him. She was the same person who had talked to him outside, Jennifer. She looked different inside the mall, more professional in her work clothes, but her smile was just as kind. "I wasn't sure you'd come," she said, and David could hear genuine pleasure in her voice. "I wasn't sure either," David admitted. He felt awkward standing there with his cardboard sign under his arm, like he didn't belong in this warm, bright place. Jennifer seemed to understand his discomfort. "Would you like to get something to eat first? The food court has some good options, and I'd be happy to treat you to dinner." David's stomach rumbled at the mention of food. He had been planning to find a cheap sandwich somewhere, but the smell of pizza and Chinese food from the food court was making his mouth water. "That's very kind," he said, "but I don't want to be a burden." "You're not a burden," Jennifer said, firmly. "You're a veteran who served our country. The least I can do is buy you a hot meal." They walked to the food court together, and Jennifer let David choose whatever he wanted. He picked a simple meal, chicken and rice from the Chinese place, but it tasted like luxury after the basic food at the shelter. Jennifer got a salad and sat across from him, asking gentle questions about his service and how long he had been in the area. David found himself talking more than he had in months. Jennifer was a good listener, nodding and asking follow-up questions that showed she really cared about his answers. She told him about her job organizing events at the mall and how she had started the community music nights because she believed everyone should have a chance to share their talents. "So many people walk through this mall every day," she said. "Everyone has a story. Everyone has something special about them. But we rarely get to see it because we're all so busy with our own lives." As they talked, David noticed other people in the food court glancing over at them. Some looks were curious, others seemed disapproving. A few tables away, he heard a woman whisper to her friend, "Why is she eating with that homeless man?" The words stung, but Jennifer either didn't hear them or chose to ignore them. When they finished eating, Jennifer suggested they walk back to the piano area. The evening crowd was starting to gather for the community music night. David counted maybe 30 or 40 people standing around in a loose circle, some holding instruments cases, others just there to listen. "We don't have any formal rules," Jennifer explained. "People just take turns playing whatever they want. Some are really good, others are just starting to learn. Everyone's welcome." David looked at the piano bench and felt his hands start to sweat. The instrument looked so perfect, so expensive. What if he sat down and couldn't remember how to play anything? What if his damaged hands made horrible sounds instead of music? "I don't know," he said quietly. "It's been a very long time since I played in front of people." "That's okay," Jennifer said. "You can just listen tonight if you want, but if you feel like playing, even just one song, I think people would love to hear it." A man with a guitar had started playing, singing an old country song in a rough but heartfelt voice. People swayed along with the music, and some sang along on the chorus. The atmosphere was relaxed and friendly, not like a formal concert where everyone had to be perfect. David found himself standing at the edge of the crowd, half hidden behind a decorative column. From here he could see everything but didn't feel too exposed. He watched as different people took turns. A woman played violin, twin boys played recorders, an elderly man sang an old jazz standard without any instrument at all. Everyone got applause no matter how well they performed. David could see that this wasn't about showing off or competing. It was about sharing something personal, something that mattered to each person. But as the evening went on, David noticed other things too. Not everyone in the crowd was there for the music. Some people were just passing through the mall and stopped to watch for a few minutes. And not all of them were kind. A group of teenagers had gathered near the food court, close enough to hear the music but far enough away to make comments without the performers hearing them. David could see them pointing and laughing when someone made a mistake or sang off key. "This is so lame," one of them said loudly enough for David to hear. "Why don't they just stay home if they can't play properly?" His friends laughed, and David felt anger rise in his chest. These kids didn't understand what it took for some of these people to stand up and share their music. They didn't know that the elderly man singing jazz might be remembering his late wife, or that the woman with the violin might be conquering a lifelong fear of performing in public. David was so focused on watching the teenagers that he almost missed Jennifer walking over to him. "The piano's free now," she said softly. "Would you like to try playing something?" David looked at the piano bench, empty and waiting. His heart started beating faster, and he could feel sweat on his palms despite the air conditioning. "I'm not sure I remember how," he said. "It's like riding a bicycle," Jennifer said with a smile. "Your hands remember even when your mind thinks it's forgotten." David looked around at the crowd. Most of the faces looked friendly and encouraging, but he could still see the teenagers near the food court, and he knew they were watching everything. That happened. "What if I mess up?" he asked. Jennifer's expression grew serious. "David, let me tell you something. I've been organizing these music nights for 2 years now. I've heard people play who could probably perform at Carnegie Hall, and I've heard people who were just learning their first song. You know what the difference is in how the audience reacts?" David shook his head. "Nothing," she said. "People appreciate honesty and courage more than perfection. The ones who get the biggest applause are usually the ones who are most nervous, because everyone can see how much it means to them." David took a deep breath and looked at his hands. The scars seemed more visible under the bright mall lights, and his missing fingers felt more obvious than usual. But Jennifer was right about one thing. His hands did remember. Even now he could feel them wanting to move to the rhythm of an old song. "Okay," he said quietly. "I'll try." Jennifer's face lit up with a big smile. "Wonderful. Take your time. And remember, everyone here is rooting for you." David walked slowly toward the piano, feeling like every eye in the mall was on him. The crowd parted to let him through, and he heard a few people whisper, "Thank you for your service," when they saw his military jacket. As he got closer to the piano, the teenagers' voices became clearer. "Oh man, look at this guy," one of them said with a snicker. "This should be good." "Check out his hands," another one added, pointing. "How's he supposed to play piano like that?" "Somebody should stop him before he embarrasses himself," a third voice chimed in. David's steps slowed as their words hit him. He could feel his confidence draining away like water through a broken cup. Maybe this was a mistake. Maybe he should just turn around and walk away before he made a fool of himself. But then he heard Jennifer's voice behind him, clear and strong. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a special performer tonight. This is David, a veteran who served our country with honor. Let's give him our full attention and respect." The crowd immediately quieted down and turned toward David with expectant faces. Even some of the teenagers stopped talking, though David could see them still smirking and holding up their phones, probably planning to record whatever happened next. David reached the piano bench and stood there for a moment, looking down at the keys. They were so white and perfect, like teeth in a giant smile. He could see his reflection in the polished black surface of the piano's body, a tired, weathered man who looked nothing like the young soldier who used to dream of playing concerts. Slowly, David sat down on the bench and adjusted his position. The seat was exactly the right height, and the pedals were positioned perfectly under his feet. For a moment, he felt like he was home. But when he lifted his hands toward the keys, the whispers started again. "Look at those fingers," someone said, not quite quietly enough. "This is going to be a disaster," another voice added. "Should someone tell him to stop?" David's hands froze in the air above the keyboard. The scars on his right hand seemed to throb, and the gaps where his missing fingers should have been felt like open wounds. All around him, he could sense people staring, waiting to see what the broken soldier would do. His hands started to shake slightly, not from the cold this time, but from fear and shame and the weight of all those watching eyes. Maybe the teenagers were right. Maybe he should just get up and walk away before he humiliated himself in front of all these people. David's fingers hovered over the keys, trembling with uncertainty, as the crowd waited in silence that felt both expectant and cruel. In that moment, sitting at the beautiful piano with his damaged hands on display for everyone to see, David had to make a choice that would define not just this evening, but possibly the rest of his life. The teenagers continued to watch with their phones ready, expecting to capture something they could laugh about later. The Kinder members of the audience waited hopefully, believing that something special was about to happen. And Jennifer stood nearby, her eyes full of faith in a man who had almost forgotten how to have faith in himself. David closed his eyes and tried to remember what music used to feel like before the war, before the explosion, before everything fell apart. He tried to remember his grandmother's hands guiding his fingers over the keys when he was 7 years old. He tried to remember the joy he used to feel when a song came together perfectly, when all the notes flowed like water, and time seemed to stop. But all he could hear were the whispers and snickers around him. All he could feel were the empty spaces where his fingers used to be. All he could see in his mind were the disappointed faces of people who expected music and would get only broken sounds from broken hands. The silence stretched on, growing more uncomfortable with each passing second. David could sense the crowd getting restless, could hear the teenagers getting ready to make their jokes, could feel Jennifer's hopeful energy starting to turn into worry. His hands remained frozen above the keys, caught between a dream that felt impossible and a reality that seemed too painful to face. In that moment of suspension, David realized that everyone in that crowd, the believers and the mockers, the hopeful and the cruel, were all waiting to discover the same thing he was, whether there was still any music left in a soldier whose hands had been broken by war. David's hands hung in the air above the piano keys like birds that had forgotten how to fly. The silence around him felt heavy, pressing down on his shoulders like a weight he couldn't escape. Every second that passed made the moment more awkward, more painful, more impossible. He could hear his own heartbeat in his ears. He could feel sweat forming on his forehead despite the mall's air conditioning. Behind him, the crowd was getting restless. Someone coughed. A child asked their parent a question in a loud whisper. The teenagers near the food court were barely containing their laughter. David opened his eyes and looked down at the keys again. 88 black and white keys, the same as every piano he had ever played. But these keys seemed to mock him now, perfect and unmarked, waiting for fingers that were no longer whole. He started to lower his hands, ready to give up before he even tried. This had been a mistake. Jennifer meant well, but she didn't understand. You couldn't make music with broken hands. You couldn't create beauty when you were broken yourself. But then somewhere in the back of his mind he heard his grandmother's voice. It was just a whisper of memory, but it stopped him cold. Music doesn't come from your fingers, honey, she had told him when he was 8 years old and frustrated because he couldn't play a difficult piece. Music comes from your heart. Your fingers are just the messengers. David's hands stopped moving downward. He thought about his grandmother, about the way she had smiled when he played for her. She never cared if he hit a wrong note or if his timing was off. She just loved hearing him try, loved seeing him put his whole heart into the music. The teenagers were whispering louder now, making jokes that David couldn't quite hear but could certainly feel. Part of him wanted to stand up and tell them exactly what he thought of their cruelty. Part of him wanted to walk away and never look back, but a bigger part of him suddenly felt angry. Not at the teenagers exactly, but at everything that had brought him to this moment. Angry at the war that had taken his fingers. Angry at the system that had failed to help him when he came home. Angry at himself for believing that his worth as a person was tied to his ability to play piano perfectly. The anger felt good. It felt better than fear or shame. And anger, David realized, could be fuel for music just as much as joy or love. He placed his hands on the keys. The first touch was electric. Even after all these years, even with his missing fingers and scars, the feel of smooth ivory under his fingertips brought back a flood of memories. His body remembered how to sit at a piano, how to position his hands, how to breathe with the music. David started with a single note. Middle C, the same note his grandmother had taught him first. The sound rang out clear and pure through the mall's sound system, cutting through all the whispers and background noise like a sword through silk. The note hung in the air for a long moment. Then David played another note, and another. He wasn't playing a song yet, just remembering how it felt to make music. Each note was clean and sure, and with every sound he made, David felt a little bit of his old confidence returning. Then he began to play Amazing Grace. It was a song everyone knew, a song that meant something to people of all backgrounds. But David wasn't playing it the way it was written. He couldn't. His missing fingers made that impossible. Instead, he was adapting it, finding new ways to create the melody and harmony. His left hand, missing 2 fingers, used his thumb and remaining fingers to play the bass notes, but he also used the side of his hand, the palm, even his wrist when he needed to reach certain keys. His right hand carried the melody, the scars across his palm making his movements look different from a normal pianist, but not making the music any less beautiful. The sound that came from the piano was unlike anything the crowd had heard before. It wasn't technically perfect. There were gaps where other fingers would have filled in the harmony, places where the rhythm was slightly different because David had to reach around his limitations. But it was hauntingly beautiful in a way that perfect technique could never be. David closed his eyes as he played, letting the music flow through him the way it used to when he was young. He forgot about the crowd, forgot about the teenagers with their phones, forgot about everything except the conversation between his hands and the keys. The whispers and snickers stopped completely. David couldn't see it with his eyes closed, but the entire crowd had gone still, listening with the attention that bordered on reverence. Even the teenagers had lowered their phones, their mocking expressions replaced by something like wonder. As David played, his body began to move with the music. His shoulders swayed slightly with the rhythm. His head tilted as he listened to the notes echo through the mall's open space. This was what Jennifer had meant when she said music came from the heart. This wasn't about technical perfection. This was about soul. When Amazing Grace came to an end, David didn't stop. Without pause, he flowed into another piece, something he had written himself during his recovery in the military hospital. He had never played it for anyone before, had barely even played it for himself. But sitting here now, with his hands, remembering how to make music, it felt like the right time to share it. This piece was more complex, more personal. It started soft and sad, like morning mist over a battlefield. The melody spoke of loss and pain, of young men far from home, of dreams interrupted by the harsh realities of war. David's damaged hands found ways to express emotions that words could never capture. But as the song continued, it began to change. The sad notes gave way to something stronger, more hopeful. This was the part David had written when he first started to believe that he might survive his injuries, that life might still have meaning even if it looked different than he had planned. The music grew louder, more confident. David's left hand found a rhythm that sounded like a heartbeat, while his right hand soared with a melody that spoke of resilience and determination. His missing fingers didn't matter anymore. He was finding ways to make the music complete despite his limitations. The crowd around him had grown larger without David noticing. Word was spreading through the mall that something special was happening near the piano. Shoppers were abandoning their errands to listen. Store employees were stepping out of their shops. Even mall security guards had gathered at the edges of the crowd, their usual stern expressions softened by the music. David's composition reached its climax, a part where both hands worked together to create a sound that was both triumphant and bittersweet. This was the part he had written when he realized that being wounded didn't make him broken, just different. That his scars were not signs of failure, but proof of survival. As the original piece came to an end, David felt the crowd's attention like a physical presence. But instead of making him nervous, it energized him. These people weren't just listening to music, they were hearing his story, understanding something about the human experience that couldn't be communicated any other way. Without stopping, David transitioned into the Star-Spangled Banner. But this wasn't the version you hear at baseball games or school assemblies. This was a deeply personal interpretation, arranged to work with his physical limitations but also to express his complex feelings about service and sacrifice. The opening notes were played with restraint, almost hesitant. This was the part about young people answering their country's call, not fully understanding what they were signing up for. David's right hand carried the familiar melody, while his left hand provided a counterpoint that suggested both pride and uncertainty. As the song continued, it grew more intense. The rocket's red glare section became a musical representation of combat. Jarring, chaotic, beautiful, and terrible at the same time. David's hands moved across the keys with increasing urgency, creating sounds that seemed to capture the confusion and brotherhood of war. But it was the ending that brought tears to many eyes in the crowd. David slowed the final phrases, playing them with a tenderness that spoke of love for country, tempered by the knowledge of what that love sometimes costs. The last notes hung in the air like a prayer, like a blessing, like a farewell to innocence. When the final note faded away, the silence that followed was different from the uncomfortable quiet at the beginning. This was the silence of people who had been moved, who had experienced something that would stay with them long after they left the mall. David sat with his hands still on the keys, his eyes still closed, breathing deeply. He could hardly believe what had just happened. For 20 minutes, maybe more, he had been completely lost in the music. His damaged hands had found ways to create beauty that he never thought possible. The songs had poured out of him like they were waiting all these years to be shared. Slowly, David opened his eyes and looked out at the crowd. What he saw took his breath away. People were crying. Not just a few people, but many of them. The elderly man who had sung jazz earlier had tears streaming down his cheeks. A mother was holding her young daughter close, both of them looking at David with something like awe. Even some of the teenagers who had been mocking him earlier looked stunned, their expressions completely changed. And then the applause started. It began with one person clapping slowly, deliberately. Then another joined in, and another. Within seconds, the entire crowd was applauding, but it wasn't ordinary applause. It was the kind of sustained emotional ovation usually reserved for concert halls and special occasions. People began to stand up, first just a few, then more and more, until the entire crowd was on their feet. The applause grew louder, more enthusiastic. David could see store employees clapping from their doorways. He could see people on the upper level of the mall looking down and applauding. But it wasn't just the volume of the applause that overwhelmed David. It was the expressions on people's faces. They weren't just appreciating good music. They were looking at him with respect, with admiration, with a kind of understanding that he hadn't felt in years. The teenagers who had been ready to mock him were now applauding as enthusiastically as anyone. One of them, a girl who couldn't have been more than 16, was crying openly as she clapped. When she caught David's eye, she mouthed the words, "Thank you," with such sincerity that David felt his own eyes fill with tears. Jennifer was standing near the edge of the crowd, and when David looked at her, he saw that she was beaming with pride and satisfaction. She had known somehow that this would happen. She had seen something in him that he had forgotten existed. The applause continued for what felt like forever, but probably lasted only a few minutes. When it finally began to die down, David realized he needed to say something. He stood up slowly, from the piano bench, his legs a little shaky from the intensity of the experience. "Thank you," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the mall's acoustics. "I haven't played for an audience in a very long time. I forgot how good it feels to share music with people." More applause erupted, and David had to wait for it to quiet down before he could continue. "I want you all to know," he said, looking around at the faces in the crowd, "that music saved my life tonight, not just playing it, but seeing how you listened to it, how you responded to it. You reminded me that being broken doesn't mean being worthless. Sometimes the most beautiful things come from the places where we've been cracked open." The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word. "Music doesn't require perfect hands," David continued, looking down at his scars and missing fingers. "It requires a willing heart. And all of you, by listening so generously, by being so kind to a stranger, you gave my heart a reason to be willing again." He looked specifically at the teenagers who had been mocking him earlier. "And to the young people here tonight, I hope you'll remember that everyone has a story. Everyone has something beautiful inside them, even if it doesn't look the way you expect it to." One of the teenagers, a boy with spiky hair who had been the loudest mocker earlier, stepped forward slightly. "Sir," he said, his voice cracking. With emotion, "I'm really sorry about what we said before. That was incredible. I've never heard anything like that." David smiled at the boy, feeling no anger or resentment. "Thank you for saying that. It takes courage to admit when we've made a mistake." The crowd began to disperse slowly, but many people lingered, wanting to talk to David or simply to stay close to the magic that had happened around the piano. Store employees came over to shake his hand. Parents brought their children to meet him. Several people asked if he gave lessons or performed anywhere regularly. Each conversation was a small gift, a reminder that he had value beyond his disabilities or his homelessness. These people weren't seeing him as a charity case or a broken veteran. They were seeing him as an artist, as someone who had shared something precious with them. As the crowd thinned out, Jennifer approached him with tears still visible in her eyes. "David," she said, "that was one of the most beautiful things I've ever experienced. I knew you had talent, but what you just did was so much more than talent. That was pure soul." David felt overwhelmed by her words, by the entire evening, by the realization that his life might be about to change in ways he couldn't imagine. "I don't know what to say," he admitted. "A few hours ago I was sitting outside in the cold wondering how I was going to get through another night. Now, Jennifer said with a smile, now we need to talk about your future." The mall had mostly emptied out by the time David and Jennifer finished talking with the last few people who wanted to meet him. The janitors were starting their evening cleaning routine, pushing their carts between the stores and wiping down surfaces. But the piano area still hummed with an energy that felt different from the usual end-of-day atmosphere. David sat back down on the piano bench, not to play but just to process everything that had happened. His hands were resting on his knees, and he kept looking down at them with something like wonder. These same hands that had felt so useless and broken just hours ago had created something that moved people to tears. "I still can't believe that really happened," he said to Jennifer, who was sitting on a nearby chair, her evening's work forgotten in the wake of David's performance. "Believe it," Jennifer said with a warm smile. "I've organized dozens of these community music nights, and I've never seen anything like what you just did. People were transformed by your music." As if to prove her point, a woman appeared at the edge of the piano area. She was in her 40s, well-dressed, with the kind of confident bearing that suggested she was used to being in charge of things. She approached David and Jennifer with quick, purposeful steps. "Excuse me," she said, extending her hand to David. "I'm Dr. Rebecca Walsh. I'm a music therapist at City General Hospital, and I just witnessed your performance. Would you mind if I talked with you for a few minutes?" David shook her hand, feeling confused. "A music therapist? I'm not sure what that means." Dr. Walsh smiled. "It means I use music to help people heal, physically, emotionally, sometimes both. I work primarily with veterans who are dealing with various challenges related to their service: PTSD, physical disabilities, depression, substance abuse issues. Music can be incredibly powerful medicine for all of these things." David nodded slowly. He had heard of therapy for veterans, but music therapy was something new to him. "What you did tonight," Dr. Walsh continued, "demonstrated something I try to teach all my patients: that our wounds don't have to define our limitations, that creativity can flourish even in the midst of, or perhaps because of, our struggles." She paused, studying David's face. "I'm wondering if you'd be interested in visiting our program, not as a patient, though we could certainly provide services if you need them, but potentially as someone who could help other veterans through music." David felt his heart skip a beat. "Help other veterans? How?" "Well," Dr. Walsh said, settling into a chair next to Jennifer, "we have a lot of veterans in our program who feel hopeless about their disabilities. They've been told what they can't do so many times that they've forgotten to explore what they can do. Seeing someone like you, someone who's found a way to make beautiful music despite significant injuries, could be incredibly inspiring for them." Jennifer leaned forward, her eyes bright with excitement. "That's a wonderful idea. David, you could show them that adaptation doesn't mean giving up." David looked down at his hands again. The idea was appealing, but also scary. I don't know if I'm qualified to help anyone. I mean, look at me. I'm homeless. I'm living in a shelter. I'm not exactly a success story. Dr. Walsh's expression grew gentle but firm. David, success isn't measured by your housing situation or your bank account. It's measured by your ability to create meaning and beauty in the face of adversity. What you did tonight was one of the most successful things I've ever witnessed. She reached into her purse and pulled out a business card. I'm not asking you to make any decisions tonight, but I'd love for you to come visit our program next week. Meet some of the veterans we work with, see if you feel a connection with what we're doing. David took the card and read it. City General Hospital, Department of Veteran Services, Music, Therapy Program. The address wasn't far from the shelter where he was staying. There would be compensation, of course, Dr. Walsh added. This wouldn't be volunteer work. We have funding for peer counselors and therapeutic assistants. If you decided to work with us, you'd be helping people while earning enough to get back on your feet. David felt overwhelmed. A few hours ago, his biggest concern had been whether he could panhandle enough money for dinner. Now someone was offering him a job, a chance to help other people, a way to use his music for something meaningful. I don't understand, he said quietly. How can you offer me a job based on one performance? You don't know anything about me. Dr. Walsh smiled. I know that you served your country and were wounded in that service. I know that you've faced homelessness and probably depression, maybe addiction, maybe thoughts of suicide, because those are challenges that affect far too many veterans. And I know that despite all of that, you found the courage tonight to sit at a piano and share your soul with a room full of strangers. She paused, letting her words sink in. Most importantly, she continued, I know that you didn't just play music tonight. You told a story, the story of a person who refused to let his wounds have the final word. That's exactly the story our veterans need to hear. While David was processing Dr. Walsh's offer, Jennifer had been thinking about something else. David, she said, I want to show you something. She pulled out her phone and started scrolling through it. While you were playing, several people in the audience were recording your performance. I hope that's okay. I know you didn't give permission, but I think you should see how your music affected people. She turned her phone screen toward David, and he saw a video of himself playing Amazing Grace. The person filming had captured not just David at the piano, but also the audience's reaction. David could see the exact moment when the snickering stopped and genuine attention began. He could see faces changing from skeptical to amazed to moved. This video has already been shared dozens of times, Jennifer said. People are calling it Homeless Veterans' Incredible Piano Performance and the most beautiful music you'll ever hear. The comments are all positive. People are asking where you perform, if you give lessons, if you have any recordings available. David stared at the phone screen in disbelief. He had never imagined that his music could reach beyond the people who were physically present to hear it. Jennifer scrolled to another video, this one filmed by someone else from a different angle. This one focuses more on your hands, she said. People are amazed by how you've adapted your technique. Some of the comments are from other disabled musicians saying you've inspired them to start playing again. Dr. Walsh leaned over to look at the phone. This is incredible. David, you're already helping people and you don't even know it. These videos are going to reach veterans all over the country who think their injuries mean they have to give up their dreams. David felt tears forming in his eyes as he read some of the comments on the videos. I'm a vet who lost my leg in Iraq. This man just showed me that I'm making excuses for not playing guitar anymore. My son was wounded in Afghanistan and won't even try to do the things he used to love. I'm going to show him this video. I've been feeling sorry for myself because of my arthritis. This gentleman just taught me that music finds a way. Most beautiful version of the Star-Spangled Banner I've ever heard. This man honored our country and our veterans in a way that no perfect performance ever could. David handed the phone back to Jennifer, too emotional to keep reading. I never intended for any of this to happen, he said. I just wanted to play music again. That's exactly why it's so powerful, Dr. Walsh said. You weren't performing for fame or recognition. You were sharing something deeply personal, something that came from your experience of pain and healing. That authenticity is what reaches people. Jennifer looked at her phone again. David, I have an idea. What if we set up regular performances here at the mall? Not just the community music nights, but special concerts featuring you. We could raise money for veteran services, homeless programs, music therapy, all the causes that your story represents. And, Dr. Walsh added, those performances could be part of your work with our therapy program. We could bring veterans here to see you play. Show them that recovery doesn't mean returning to exactly who you were before, but discovering who you can become. David felt like his head was spinning. This morning he had been a forgotten homeless man sitting outside in the cold. Tonight, two professional women were talking about building programs around his music. It felt too good to be true. I need to ask you something, David said, looking at both women. Why are you doing this for me? What do you get out of helping someone like me? Jennifer and Dr. Walsh exchanged a look, and Dr. Walsh spoke first. My brother was a Marine, she said quietly. He served 3 tours in Iraq and came home with severe PTSD. The VA tried to help him, but he fell through the cracks. He died by suicide 2 years ago. David's breath caught in his throat. He knew that story, knew it because he had come close to living it himself. Every veteran I can help, Dr. Walsh continued, every life I can impact is a way of honoring my brother's memory. And David, I believe you could help veterans in ways that I can't, because you've walked in their shoes. Jennifer nodded. And for me, this is about community. I grew up in this mall practically. My mom worked here when I was a kid, and I spent my afternoons doing homework in the food court. This place has always been about bringing people together, but usually just for shopping. Tonight, you turned it into something sacred. David felt humbled by their stories, by their willingness to invest in his future. There's one more thing, Jennifer said, pulling out another business card. I called someone while you were talking. To people after your performance. There's a local news station that wants to do a story about what happened tonight. They want to interview you, talk about veteran homelessness, highlight the music therapy program Dr. Walsh mentioned. David's first instinct was to refuse. He wasn't comfortable with the idea of being on television, having his story broadcast to thousands of people. But then he thought about the comments on the videos, about the veterans who had been inspired by his performance. Maybe his story could help more people than just those who happened to be in the mall tonight. Would it really help other veterans, he asked. Absolutely, Dr. Walsh said. Visibility is one of our biggest challenges. People don't understand the scope of veteran homelessness or the effectiveness of alternative therapies like music. Your story could change minds and possibly save lives. David was quiet for a long moment, thinking about everything that had happened. This morning, he had been invisible to most people, just another homeless person to step around on the sidewalk. Tonight, he felt seen and valued in a way he hadn't experienced since before his injury. Okay, he said finally. I'll do the interview. I'll visit your program, Dr. Walsh. And Jennifer, if you really think people would come to hear me play, I'd be honored to perform here again. Both women smiled, and David could see the satisfaction in their faces. But it wasn't the satisfaction of people who had done a good deed for charity. It was the satisfaction of people who recognized talent and potential and had been able to help it flourish. There's just one thing, David said, looking at his hands again. I'm still living in a shelter. I still don't have much more than the clothes on my back. This all feels amazing, but I don't want to get ahead of myself. Dr. Walsh reached into her purse again and pulled out a different card. This is for our social services coordinator. Call her tomorrow morning. We work with several programs that help veterans transition to stable housing. Between the potential income from working with us and the resources we can connect you with, I think we can get you into an apartment within a few weeks. David took the card with shaking hands. An apartment, a job, the chance to use his music, to help other people. 6 hours ago, none of this had seemed possible. I don't know how to thank you both, he said. You already have, Jennifer said. You trusted us enough to play tonight. You shared your story through your music. You reminded everyone in that audience that every person they pass on the street has value and dignity and something beautiful to offer. Dr. Walsh stood up and gathered her things. David, I'm going to leave you my personal cell phone number. If you need anything between now and when you visit our program, a meal, a ride, someone to talk to, please call me. What happened tonight was just the beginning. As the three of them prepared to leave the mall, David looked back at the piano one more time. The instrument sat quietly under the twinkling lights, waiting for the next person who would need to share their story through music. But for David, everything had changed. He was still the same man who had sat on the cold steps this morning, still had the same scars and missing fingers, still faced the same challenges that came with being homeless and disabled. The difference was that now he remembered who he was, underneath all of those circumstances. He was a musician. He was a storyteller. He was someone who could take pain and transform it into beauty, someone who could help other people find hope in their darkest moments. As they walked toward the mall's exit, David's steps were steadier than they had been in years. For the first time since his injury, he was walking toward a future that felt full of possibility rather than just survival. The automatic doors opened as they approached, and David stepped out into the cool night air. But this time, instead of feeling the cold as another hardship to endure, he felt it as a reminder that he was alive, that he had survived, and that his story was far from over. 3 weeks had passed since that life-changing evening at the mall, and David could hardly recognize his own life. As he stood in front of the bathroom mirror in his new studio apartment, adjusting the collar of a shirt that actually fit him properly, he still felt like he might wake up and discover it had all been a dream. The apartment was small but clean, with large windows that let in plenty of morning light. It came furnished with basic furniture through a veteran housing program that Dr. Walsh had connected him with. But the most important piece of furniture was the old upright piano that now sat against the far wall. Jennifer had organized a fundraiser at the mall, selling recordings of David's performance that people had made on their phones that night. The money raised was enough to buy the piano and have it moved to David's apartment. It wasn't a grand piano like the one at the mall, but when David sat down to play it each morning, it felt like coming home. The news story about David's performance had aired 5 days after that first evening, and the response had been overwhelming. The reporter, a woman named Patricia who specialized in human interest stories, had done an excellent job of focusing on the music and the message, rather than just the tragedy of homelessness. The interview had been filmed partially at the mall, with David playing excerpts from his performance, and partially at the hospital where Dr. Walsh worked. They had shown David meeting with other wounded veterans, talking about adaptation and resilience, demonstrating how he had modified his playing technique to work with his injuries. But what really made the story powerful was the follow-up they had done with some of the people who had been in the audience that first night. The teenager who had initially mocked David appeared on camera to talk about how the experience had changed his perspective on homeless people and disabled veterans. "I learned that you can't judge someone by how they look," the young man had said, his voice serious and mature. "This guy taught me that being broken doesn't mean being worthless. Actually, sometimes being broken is what makes you beautiful." The story had been picked up by national news outlets, and within a week, videos of David's performance had been viewed millions of times online. The comments sections were filled with stories from other veterans, other disabled musicians, other people who had faced setbacks and found inspiration in David's story. More importantly for David personally, the attention had brought real opportunities. Dr. Walsh had officially hired him as a peer counselor and music therapy assistant at the Veterans Hospital. The work was part-time to start, but it paid enough to cover his rent and basic expenses with health insurance included. David's days now had structure and purpose. 3 mornings a week, he went to the hospital to work with veterans in the music therapy program. Some of them were dealing with physical disabilities like his own. Others were struggling with PTSD, depression, or substance abuse issues. All of them needed to hear that recovery was possible, that they still had value, that their stories weren't over. Working with other veterans had been emotionally challenging but deeply rewarding. David found that his own experience of hitting rock bottom and climbing back up made him credible in ways that traditional counselors sometimes weren't. When he talked to a veteran about adapting to life with a disability, they knew he understood. When he demonstrated how he had modified his piano technique, They could see proof that creativity could flourish even within limitations. One veteran in particular had made a deep impression on David. Tommy was a young Marine who had lost both legs in an explosion in Syria. He had been a drummer before his deployment, and he was convinced that his musical days were over. "How am I supposed to use kick pedals with no legs?" Tommy had asked during their first session together, his voice bitter with frustration. David had spent 3 sessions with Tommy, not talking about drums at all, but exploring how music could be adapted rather than abandoned. They worked with hand percussion, with electronic drum pads that could be triggered in different ways, with the idea that rhythm was about more than just feet and legs. By the 4th session, Tommy was experimenting with a modified drum kit that let him create beats using only his hands and upper body. The music he made was different from what he had played before his injury, but it was undeniably his own style, uniquely beautiful. "I never thought I'd make music again," Tommy had told David after successfully playing through an entire song. "You showed me that different doesn't mean worse." Stories like Tommy's reminded David why this work mattered. But the hospital wasn't the only place where his music was making a difference. Jennifer had been true to her word about organizing regular performances at the mall. Every Friday evening, David now played a short concert in the main atrium. The mall had installed a permanent sound system for the performances, and they had designated the area as Veterans Memorial Music Corner, with a plaque honoring all veterans who had served. The Friday night concerts had become a community tradition. Families would plan their shopping trips around David's performances. Local veterans organizations started using the concerts as informal meetups. Other musicians began asking if they could perform alongside David, turning the evenings into collaborative celebrations of music and community. But perhaps the most meaningful change was in how David saw himself. For years after his injury, he had defined himself by what he couldn't do anymore. He couldn't play piano the way he used to. He couldn't work certain types of jobs. He couldn't live the life he had planned before the war. Now, he was learning to define himself by what he could do. He could adapt classical pieces for his unique technique. He could help other veterans find hope in their darkest moments. He could turn a shopping mall into a concert hall and transform strangers into a community through the power of shared music. The scars on his hands hadn't disappeared, and his missing fingers weren't going to grow back. But David no longer saw these as symbols of loss. They had become part of his identity as a musician, integral to the unique sound he created and the story he told through his performances. On this particular morning, David was getting ready for a special event. The local symphony orchestra had invited him to perform as a guest soloist at their upcoming concert. The piece they wanted him to play was his own composition, the one he had written in the hospital and first shared publicly that night at the mall. The symphony's conductor had heard David's story and been moved by both the music and the message. "We want our audience to understand that classical music isn't just about perfection," she had explained when she called to invite him. "Your piece demonstrates that the most powerful music comes from genuine human experience." David was nervous about performing with a full orchestra, but also excited. The little boy who had dreamed of playing in concert halls was finally going to get his chance, even if the path there had been nothing like what he had imagined. As he prepared to leave for his rehearsal at the symphony hall, David's phone rang. The caller ID showed Patricia, the reporter who had done the original news story about him. "David, I hope you don't mind me calling," she said when he answered, "but I have some news I thought you'd want to hear." "Of course. What's going on?" You remember that video of your performance that went viral? Well, it's been seen by someone pretty important. The White House has been in touch with our news director. They want to invite you to perform at a special event honoring wounded veterans. David sat down heavily on his couch, overwhelmed by the news. "The White House? Are you serious?" "Completely serious," Patricia said, and David could hear the smile in her voice. "Apparently, the president saw your story and was moved by it. They're planning a ceremony to highlight veteran services and the importance of supporting wounded warriors. They want you to be part of it." David thought about the cardboard sign he had held just a few weeks ago, about sitting on those cold concrete steps feeling invisible and forgotten. Now the President of the United States wanted him to perform at the White House. "I don't know what to say," David admitted. "You don't have to say anything right now," Patricia said. "They'll be calling you directly with details. I just wanted to give you a heads up. David, I hope you realize what an incredible impact your story has had. You've changed people's minds about homelessness, about disability, about what's possible when we refuse to give up on each other." After Patricia hung up, David sat in his quiet apartment for a few minutes, trying to process everything that had happened since that November evening when he had walked into the mall scared and broken. He looked at the piano against the wall, at the certificates from the hospital hanging beside it, at the newspaper clippings and printouts of positive online comments that Jennifer had given him. But what struck him most was a letter he had received the week before from a veteran in Colorado. The letter was from a woman named Lisa, who had been medically discharged from the Navy after a training accident left her with severe injuries to her arms. She had seen David's story online and wanted to thank him for showing her that adaptation didn't mean giving up. "I threw my guitar in the closet 2 years ago and never touched it again," she had written. "After seeing what you did with piano, I pulled it back out and started experimenting with different ways to play. I'm not the guitarist I used to be, but I'm becoming a different kind of guitarist. And that's okay. Thank you for showing me that. Different can be beautiful." David had received dozens of similar letters from veterans, disabled musicians, and people facing various challenges. Each one reminded him that his decision to sit down at that piano had rippled outward in ways he never could have imagined. As he prepared to leave for symphony rehearsal, David picked up the cardboard sign he had kept from that first day. He looked at the simple words, "Homeless veteran, anything helps, God bless." The sign represented everything he had lost, his housing, his dignity, his sense of purpose. But it also represented the moment when Jennifer had seen past the surface and recognized the person underneath. It represented the community that had formed around music that night, the connections that had been made between strangers through shared vulnerability and beauty. David carefully placed the sign in a frame and hung it on the wall next to his certificates and awards. It wasn't a symbol of shame anymore, but a reminder of how far he had traveled and how many people had helped him along the way. When David arrived at the symphony hall for rehearsal, he was surprised to find that several of the musicians had been following his story. They welcomed him warmly, many of them sharing their own stories of adaptation and resilience in their musical careers. The conductor, a woman in her 50s with silver hair and kind eyes, spent extra time working with David to integrate his unique style with the orchestra's sound. Instead of trying to make him play like a traditional pianist, she helped the ensemble adapt to his approach, creating arrangements that showcased his distinctive technique. "Music is about communication," she told the orchestra during a break, in rehearsal. "David's playing communicates something that technical perfection never could. Our job is to support that communication, not change it." As David played through his composition with the full orchestra for the first time, he felt the same sense of transcendence he had experienced that first night at the mall. The music wasn't just notes and rhythms anymore. It was a conversation between his experience and the experiences of everyone in the room, a shared expression of what it meant to be human in all its complexity. After rehearsal, as David walked back to his car, he thought about Tommy and the other veterans he worked with at the hospital. He thought about the teenager who had learned not to judge people by their appearance. He thought about Lisa in Colorado and all the other people who had found inspiration in his story. Most of all, he thought about the power of music to bridge differences, to create understanding, to transform pain into beauty. That power hadn't come from his technical skill or perfect fingers. It had come from his willingness to be vulnerable, to share his authentic experience, to trust that his story mattered. David's hands still bore the scars of war, and he was still missing 2 fingers. But as he drove home to his apartment with the piano by the window, he understood that those weren't signs of what was broken about him. They were proof of what was unbreakable: his spirit, his capacity for joy, his ability to create meaning from whatever materials life had given him. The homeless veteran who had sat outside the mall just a few weeks ago was gone, replaced by a man who understood his own worth and power. But David would never forget that earlier version of himself, because that man's courage to try one more time, to risk failure and judgment in pursuit of something beautiful, had made everything else possible. Tonight, David would practice his piece one more time before bed. Tomorrow, he would go to the hospital and help other veterans discover their own paths to healing. Next week, he would perform with a full orchestra. Next month, if things went as planned, he might play at the White House. But right now, in this moment, David was simply grateful to be alive, to have music in his life again, and to know that his story, scars, missing fingers and all, had the power to change the world, one note at a time. The piano was waiting for him when he got home, just as it had been waiting for him that night at the mall. But this time, when David sat down to play, he wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone. He was simply sharing the gift he had been given, the gift that no explosion could destroy and no hardship could take away. He was making music, and through that music, he was making hope.